Jonah Neuenhaus. He has completed his fieldwork a time ago, is now writing his PhD, has recently been employed by our Frobenius-Institut, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please, Jonah.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Yes, as you just said, I will present some aspects of my PhD research. The project is based on, in general, 16 months of field research in urban Kyrgyzstan specifically, from which I returned last September. And today I will reflect on one part of my argument that forms like the spine of the first part of my dissertation, or supposed to. And to do that, I will reflect critically on the category on conversion in relation to some of my findings. Though the dissertation as a whole, is it not working?
I want to give you the full frame, sorry.
Sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. No. Yes.
Okay, thank you. The dissertation as a whole is also, will include an investigation into what it means to be Baha'i in urban Kyrgyzstan more generally. So, in the beginning, I would just want to emphasize that this is, of course, a particularly incomplete analysis of what conversion is. But, and in this sense, complexities will be lost, especially with regards to the social, political, and cultural embeddedness of such processes of becoming Baha'i. We don't have the pointer, right? Okay, you can see the mouse, I guess. So, most of my research I spent in Bishkek, the capital city of Kyrgyzstan, which you can see is in the north of Kyrgyzstan, right next to the border of Kazakhstan. But I also stayed in the regional center Tokmak, which is an hour east of Bishkek, and I also spent time in Osh, which is in the Fergana Valley in the south of the country, close to the Uzbek border. These urban spaces were natural choices just because they are the only spaces in which Baha'is live, or Baha'i communities exist. To become a bit more specific, the global Baha'i community consists of 5 to 8 million people. The numbers are not quite clear, and only 230 officially registered Baha'i live in Kyrgyzstan. Even though it is a small community, especially in Bishkek, the community life is very active, with a high density of activities like study circles, prayer meetings, so-called 19-day feasts, and celebrations of holy days. Whereas the religion only came to Kyrgyzstan after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it has a quite turbulent history. After membership numbers were kind of going through the roof throughout the 90s with up to 5,000 officially declared Baha'is, community life broke down in the 2000s. And since then, especially since the 2010s, there has been a kind of like re-establishment, a consolidation of community life, and the community has been growing since, although slowly, as you can see by the numbers. Generally speaking, just to give some background information, Baha'is see the writings of Baha'u'llah, which have their origin in mid-19th century Persia, as having revealed a new message of God, which in the sense of a progressive revelation is supposed to represent a kind of update of earlier revelations. So Baha'u'llah is considered by Baha'i to be one of a series of manifestations of God, like Muhammad, like Jesus Christ, like Krishna, like Zoroaster. And each of their messages were adapted to respective times and regions, in at least in terms of social laws, while the spiritual contents of the teachings are understood as being the same. Baha'u'llah's writings now proclaim a new age in which humanity is ready and prepared to form one global unity, which is to be achieved through the dissemination of his moral teachings, but also through a specific administrative order. The center of the structure is the so-called Universal House of Justice, which has its seat in Haifa, and it is a council of 9 elected men, and you can see its seat in the Baha'i World Center right there. Baha'is in Kyrgyzstan, they do not speak of conversion when they speak of personal experiences, of transformations of their beliefs, practices, and social affiliations. They actually explicitly avoid the term. At the same time, the term is also criticized within anthropological discourses. In fact, the arguments of Baha'is and anthropologists have some key aspects in common. For example, within anthropological discourses about conversion, classic definitions of conversion as internal spiritual border crossings or sudden ruptures with the past are criticized, among other things, for their ignorance of a continuous historical, political, social, and also cultural embeddedness of such project. The prime example of such critiques are the Komarovs, as was already mentioned in research participants invoked similar ideas of continuity with regard to becoming a Baha'i. They emphasized the unity of God's revelation as well as a non-terminable process of spiritual development of the soul as the purpose of being human. So becoming Baha'i was defined through, or is defined by most Baha'is, through conceptual continuities. However, in my view, in my interpretation, such processes do also contain significant reorientations towards a new moral authority, as well as a reconceptualization of social belonging, as Hefner puts it in his definition of conversion. Therefore, in this presentation, I want to argue for the usefulness of conversion as an analytical category in describing and understanding such processes of becoming Baha'i in Kyrgyzstan, as long as they are understood to contain ruptures but also continuities at the same time. To illustrate this, following Berger and Sahu, I want to locate aspects of change and continuity in everyday lives. Today, of course, I will only talk about one such aspect, and that is the meaning of religious knowledge in everyday life for the navigation of everyday life. To do this, I have to say a few rather superficial things about the religious landscape in Kyrgyzstan, as it embeds processes of conversion and also the meaning of religious knowledge. While around 75% of the people living in Kyrgyzstan understand themselves as Muslims, what that actually means in everyday realities has been much discussed within Kyrgyz society, but also within anthropological discourses. I cannot cover it in detail here, but the integration into the Soviet Union and its subsequent collapse, of course, continues to have great consequences for religious life in Kyrgyzstan. And the first Baha'is in the 1990s came to know the Baha'i faith, let's say, as children of the Soviet Union, and its anti-religious politics that closely linked ideas of Islam to ideas of being Kyrgyz and adjacent traditions. Most of these early Baha'is understood themselves as Kyrgyz, Muslim, communist at the same time. They did not have, usually they did not have any knowledge of Islamic writings or practices, and in many cases they did not believe in the existence of God, but still called and understood themselves as Muslims. They experienced the fall of the Soviet Union as an incisive moment while being confronted with transformations on an ideological level, but also in particular with regards to social networks and material resources. Research participants found conceptual continuities between Soviet ideology and the Baha'i faith and the teachings of the Baha'i faith, like unity of mankind, equality of men and women, universal education, and universal language. But they also found an initial social experience within the Baha'i community that attracted many people. And meanwhile, scriptural teachings did not play any role in everyday lives. There were only few writings translated into Russian or Kyrgyz at that time, and only little structure in transmitting religious knowledge existed. Consequently, knowledge about, or orthopraxy, knowledge about contents of scripture and its influence on everyday life was very, very little. In fact, many different stories of becoming Baha'i share similar kinds of experiences of being attracted to continuities on an intellectual and social level, but not necessarily of coming to believe in Baha'u'llah and his spiritual teachings. So when recounting such experiences retrospectively, most Baha'is emphasized that they had been much less of a Baha'i until their relationship to religious knowledge and until their relationship to religious knowledge and practice had changed. In fact, the many forms of becoming Baha'i during the 1990s are today commonly understood to have broken down due to a lack of religious knowledge. The few early Baha'is, around 20, that still consider themselves as such, describe long processes of acquiring knowledge and that changed the whole purpose of being in relation to a new moral authority and a new body of knowledge. That's also very important, of course. And these forms of transformations, and only these, are the ones that I would consider describing as conversions. So, such experience of early Baha'is and then more recent conversions were, of course, contextualized by diversified discourses about how to live a good life as a Kyrgyz, but also as a Muslim, and also by continued volatility, as Pagmans put it, in light of a shattered transition of the Kyrgyz nation state to a liberal market economy. Additionally, the transmission of religious knowledge had been formalized on a global level of Baha'i administration and implemented on the local level in the respective communities. This formalized process is called the Institute process, and it has markedly influenced how people became to understand themselves as Baha'i. Without being able to go into detail, that would be even more boring, I think. I want to at least point to the importance of the global administrative order in implementing these activities in specific communities. Because through the different levels of administration, on a global, on a local level, but also through different transnational actors that connect these levels, the Institute process has become one of the elemental parts of community life and collective activities, but also of individual practices, especially in the capital of Bishkek, but also in Tokmak. The Institute process consists of 3 main activities which are conducted multiple times a week. Ruhi courses, which are study circles for adolescents and adults, plus junior youth groups and children classes, which are programs to transmit moral concepts to preteens, teenagers, and children as well. In the context of this presentation, I can only touch on some aspects of the Ruhi courses. These are study books based on book materials. Currently there exist 14 Ruhi books that form a sequence of courses within which the respective books build upon each other. In these courses, spiritual concepts of the Baha'i teachings are supposed to be reflected upon within a concrete social dynamic. So the material is very extensive, and finishing a book can take up between 25 but up to 60, 70 hours of study. And the courses are usually held once, twice a week, and courses, depending on respective schedules, can last from 3 to 4 up to 8 hours a day. Additionally, there are so-called intensive courses, which are held over weekends, over long days of study only. Sessions consist of reading, memorizing, and reflecting upon quotations of the writings. These courses are also part of organized and sustained efforts of establishing the activities of the Institute process in respective neighborhoods. And while some Baha'i seem to do this more strategically than others, the common denominator is that Ruhi courses are represented as instruments to improve one's capacity to serve one's community and to improve its specific conditions of life. So Baha'is in Kyrgyzstan, they never fail to emphasize that these courses do not aim at conversion, and that they only offer instruments to serve the community, to build communities. But the material itself and the practical implementation, at least again in my interpretation, creates a connectivity between, or a coupling between the effectiveness of one's service and one's spiritual development, the degree of one's spiritual development, which in turn can best be achieved by living a scripture-based everyday life, including the recognition of Baha'u'llah as manifestation of God, praying daily, reading the holy writings daily, and manifesting Baha'u'llah's teachings in general. Most long-term Baha'is describe these courses as the key element for a transformed understanding of what it means to be Baha'i, and they still visit them regularly, weekly in many cases. Only through them, so the often repeated narrative goes, they came to a better understanding of what it means to be a Baha'i. This includes explicit references to having gained religious knowledge and its translation into scripture-based everyday practice. Similarly, converts of the last 10 years that went through the institute process while meeting the Baha'i faith, while investigating it, cite their experiences within these courses as transformative and as key elements of becoming Baha'i. In this sense, the institute process has been very effective in creating a thorough engagement with religious ideal types, which does not only influence ritualized practices like daily obligatory prayers, but also the interpretations of everyday experiences and the search for ways to act. To give one short example, one Baha'i that was a very active participant in the institute process was planning to go to Australia and was unsure about going. When she heard that I had been there and that I would be providing or would share my experiences, she interpreted this as a confirmation of God, that she was on the right way. And this idea of confirmation of one's action through God, through signs in one's everyday experiences, is one that was introduced by the institute process and today is widespread in its application to interpreting specific experiences. I argue that the processes of becoming Baha'i have, over time, become much more defined through the institute process, which has led in many cases to a reorientation of everyday life towards a new moral authority and a body of knowledge that defines service to humanity as the key element, of living a good life as a Baha'i. And this body of knowledge that is part of this new moral authority defines service to humanity as the key element of the development of the soul. And in the same context, this is where, of course, this presentation is also specifically lacking in describing different perspectives and experiences, because some of the early Baha'is, as example, that still consider themselves as such, have retreated from community life, which they now experience in relation to the institute process as too restrictive, because they see more rigid understandings of what it means to be a good Baha'i, which is exactly the opposite of what attracted them in the first place. But of course my dissertation will dive deeper into that. So while I try to show that recent processes of becoming Baha'i are characterized by conceptual border crossings in relation to religious concepts, it is equally important to mention that the teachings itself are understood to dissolve any kind of boundaries, which often, again, made them so attractive in the first place. Most Kyrgyz Baha'is work very hard to be active participants in societal discourses, to dissolve boundaries by arguing and working for unity, the abolishment of prejudices, values like honesty, cooperation, equality, and justice. They do this, however, based on a new understanding. The following sentence that I've heard in many variations illustrates that quite well. Only through Baha'u'llah I found to Islam. Here Baha'i relate to the concept of progressive revelation on two levels. Firstly, they clearly indicate conceptual continuities between Islam and the Baha'i faith, which is why they could still call themselves Muslim, which they don't do. However, they also imply that only through the teachings of Baha'u'llah they found a true meaning of Islam, which Muslims in Kyrgyzstan and they themselves do not have or did not have prior to once becoming Baha'i. So the general emphasis of continuity within those narratives, including also the striving for the dissolution of any kinds of boundaries, is in my interpretation therefore already based on the reorientation towards a new moral authority and a new body of knowledge, which is why I find conversion to be an analytical category that is useful in understanding such processes of becoming Baha'i, without claiming that any kind of process of religious transformation, of belonging, should be called conversion at all. That's it. Thank you.